Alright, so we've done a lot in this section. We took the app from not having a database, not having a way to persist data, to having it persisting and saving data and so forth. And along the way, of course, we'll learn what a room database is as part of the Jetpack components. The room persistence library provides an abstraction layer over SQLite to allow for more robust database access while harnessing the full power of SQLite. So the idea here really is that with room, we no longer need to really fight hard to create a lot of different classes or having to deal with a lot of different classes to create our database. So it really abstracts out or gets rid of all the boilerplate code that we had to deal with before to create databases. So it's really great. And we learn, of course, about DI, dependency injection. So we learn the advantages of doing dependency when an object requires another object to function properly. Okay, so for instance, we learned that a car may need an engine, and so the car depends on the engine. And so we learned that although manually we can actually create those dependencies, those dependency injections, but with Hilt it's way better because manually, as the app scales, it can be very difficult to manage dependencies. So Hilt, of course, solves that problem because we then gain reusability of code, we gain ease of refactoring that code, and ease of testing, which is very important. So back to room database, we also realize that we need to have some sort of solid structure so that our apps doesn't crumble as the complexity increases, right? So we looked at the room database, but in a different light, in that we created a data access object, which is responsible for dealing with the lower level dealings, so processes like getting to our SQLite, looking at the entities tables and getting the data, or deleting and do all the CRUD operations, right? And then we put together the repository layer, which essentially is not that important. In a sense, it's not important for this to work, this whole system to work, but nonetheless, it's a very special, crucial, if I may say, piece of this puzzle here, because it allows us to have some sort of single source of truth for all app data. So we get this clean API for the UI to communicate with. Okay, so at the top level, after repository, then we have the view model. So in this case, also remember that the repository has an instance via the dependency injection, thankfully, has an instance of the DAO because it needs to access the database. And also the view model will have access to the repository because then it has to connect and get the data. Okay, now at this level here, view model, we have different data structures we could use to get still that state, right? To hold that data and the state which is needed for our user interface. So there is live data, we've looked at immutable states and so forth. But it turns out, as at this point, the best way to actually use room in the structure is to use flow state, which is another mechanism that allows us to get that state, right, which is needed for us to be able to communicate and emit the data in a stream to our user interface to then react and draw itself. And of course, along the way, we talked about a little bit about coroutines and suspend functions. So the idea you want to take away from coroutines and suspend functions is that these are mechanisms that allow us to do work in the background, away from the main user interface, from the main UI thread. Because it's important to know that in Android, the UI thread only needs to worry about showing the data, or showing the user interface, I should say, to the user to interact with. So we don't want to bug down the UI thread, because then our applications will stop and be responsive. Ultimately, the operating system will then shut them down, and that's not good, right? So that is the nutshell of coroutines and suspend functions and flows and so forth. Okay, so that was a lot that we did, and please go back if there are things that are not really that you are missing. It's okay. You can always go back and rewatch certain videos and ask questions and do some research if you're more curious about certain topics such as flow and even coroutines, since we didn't really dive deep into them. That's totally fine. All right, very excited. I hope you enjoyed this section, and I hope you've learned a lot. And please feel free also to take the app and make your own do more work on it, or perhaps you have other applications you would want to create. But now you have the base part of it, right? You have the database, how to put together the database. You understand all of that, so you can now do all sort of things. I encourage you to do so. If you do so, don't forget to share what you build with all of us so we can congratulate you. Again, so grateful you're here. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.